My name's Hannah Lewis and I'm the Senior Policy and Practice Officer over at Rethink Mental Illness. And I sort of cover all of those things, the professional, academic and lived experience boxes. I've had lived experience of body dysmorphic disorder and bulimia growing up. And then I've worked for Rethink for a couple of years, as well as leading on a project for the BDD Foundation. Also did my master's last year or the year before, looking at school-based interventions for body image, and I'm starting my PhD in October, looking at school-based interventions to prevent the onset of eating disorders as well. So, first of all, who's heard of Rethink? You have? Oh, that's good. So for those of you who haven't, Rethink's a national charity with the mission to improve the lives of people severely affected by mental illness. So looking more at that acute end. We do that through local groups, having services, successful campaigns and policy influencing, but fundamentally co-production is at the heart of everything we do, because we truly believe in valuing the insights of experts by experience to then go on and innovate and improve service delivery, and it's really the golden thread throughout all of our projects. We've delivered projects since about 2011 now, and we've focused on both children, young people and adults, and we've looked across various groups and conditions, because we really want co-production to be for everyone. It's not for an exclusive group of people. And I think that's a really important message to hold on to when we're talking about eating disorders, because I think there's a particular resistance to use co-production in eating disorder services, whether that's due to the entanglement people feel between eating disorder and identity. I'm not sure, but we've done some really good stuff with young people who have had eating disorders. We've got people who've used services in West London to then go back and do a full service evaluation. So they interviewed the staff, parents and carers and service users, and came out with some really good tangible recommendations for this service. So it's for everyone, is my point. One of the projects we did between 2015 and 2018 was called Step Up Transitions. And initially, this project was to look at the transitional period between children and adolescent mental health services and then adult mental health services. The project, it was 3 years, 2015 to 2018, funded by the Big Lottery, delivered by Rethink, and then evaluated by the Tavistock. But what we found by year 2 is that there was real scope to expand the remit to include all transitional periods in a young person's life. So we started looking at things like, what about when someone goes from school to college, or college to university, or leaves education and goes into work for the first time? By the 3rd year, we then realised that there was these emerging topics that people really were desperate to talk about. And so we started co-creating content on specific things like exam stress, cannabis use. But what I want to talk to you today about is the content we created on body image and eating disorders. So we ran a small pilot last year between the months of January and March, sort of using the co-production and step-up framework to go into schools and talk about body image and eating disorders. And I think it's really interesting as well that it's Mental Health Awareness Week this week with the theme of body image. And we're at a conference talking about emotions and eating disorders, because I think for so long people try and look at them so separately. But just going back to Dr. Una Foy's model that she shared with us earlier, if you were in that talk, you can see how body image really is a mediator between someone's emotions and their disordered eating behaviours. So it's really interesting to bear that in mind when I go through the process of co-creating content. So yeah, just to reiterate the aim, we really wanted to co-produce and pilot this school-based intervention with Young Champions. Now, Young Champions, the term we give to the network of 16 to 25-year-olds. We've got about 30 currently engaged, but we've had more and less over the years. And they're people who have lived experience of mental health conditions, either themselves or as a carer for a family member or friend. But for this particular project, we were looking at people who had lived experience of eating disorders. And we really wanted to use their insights and their expertise to then go and equip other young people with the tools that they've learned to manage their own body image and eating disorder difficulties, using fundamentally the same evidence-based CBT principles that we found were so successful in the Step Up Transitions project. So we kicked off with some exploratory focus groups. There's about 10 young champions altogether in that age bracket of 16 to 25. Mixed ethnicities, but all were female. And how we do these focus groups is we present the latest research, literature, and resources from the field, just to guide conversations. But largely conversations were led by the champions themselves. They were more there just for a stimulus and to get conversations going. Like I said, we looked at the same CBT approaches, which I'm going to go into a bit more detail later when we look at some of the examples of content. So I just really wanted to highlight some of the quotes that came out of these focus groups, just really honing in on the relationships between emotions and eating that some of the young people came up with. So you can read through them yourself, but there's some really nice stuff in there. Just coming from these 16 to 25-year-olds. I really like this one. If you struggle with eating when you're sad, perhaps count how much you eat to ensure you're getting enough calories and nutrition to be healthy. The focus should be on maintaining weight. So I think already these young people coming out with the same sort of messages that clinicians and researchers in the field have been saying and will continue to say. Again, just some other examples of how food and eating can relate to an individual's emotions. And these were a really good foundation for us to start creating content on. Of course, it shouldn't be simplified from eating disorders or body image alone as separate facets of the person's life. And just really, like Una was saying before, realising the complexity of these issues really came out at this point in the focus groups. So next up, we had co-design. And this was the process where we were taking everything we'd learned from the focus groups and all the really interesting discussions that we've been having, and we tried to adapt the Step Up CBT activities to be appropriate in eating disorder awareness. So I'll go through some of the examples, but just to reiterate the methodology, that's how we started. You know, conversations round a table like this. But then what was really important is that we sent this round to some professionals as well, some external stakeholders, just to get their view on things. And I like to think of this as like a mini Delphi method, maybe, for anyone who's that way inclined. And then when it came to co-delivery, we deliver the sessions, myself, and then two of the young champions. And that was one of the most important factors, I think. And you'll see this in the results later, but just having the young people, talking to other young people about what they've been through, what their experiences have been, and normalising them as well. And that means that the participants can, you know, perhaps recognise some of their own behaviours, thoughts and feelings in the young champions. And that was one of the really wonderful things from this project, I think. So, you know, this is more of a feasibility study, I'd say, and we only delivered in 2 schools, and they were 8 weeks apart. We only ended up delivering to 40 participants, but it's enough to get some sort of initial data, I'd say. I'll tell you about next steps a bit later on. But yeah, just a little bit of demographic information there. Now, the examples of content. Like I said, it was on these CBT principles. And anyone who's been to CBT, I know you hate it, Dave, but the first thing they'll make you do is a formulation. I know it's dry, I know it's boring. But I was thinking about what Una was saying about how, you know, it's so important to break down what someone's physical sensations are and physical arousals are. And I think this, you know, hot cross bun method is actually a really good way for young people to identify that, oh, I'm having sleep problems, oh, I'm quite weak, I'm quite fatigued. What am I feeling? What are my emotions saying there? And this is something that one of the young champions created. And they really associated things like their low self-esteem and distorted self-image and anxiety with sleep problems, concentration problems, and feelings of panic. And then they associated those physical sensations with some thoughts that they'd have, such as, I'm ugly, I need to lose weight, I wish I had bigger boobs, I wish I had a six-pack, you know, the usual sort of thoughts that someone with low body image or disordered eating would have. What's really interesting, though, is this, when we're looking at thoughts and what we do with them. Because, you know, probably one of the most common thoughts that people have is this, I am fat, or I feel fat. Now, it's the feeling bit that is really interesting, because what we do is, has anyone heard of taking your thoughts to court? Yeah, it's a really basic method of just getting a thought and really unpacking what's going on there. So what we'd do is we'd have that thought of I feel fat, and we'd unpack the evidence for it and against it. And just sort of say, oh, would this stand up in court? And most of the time, it wouldn't. And most of the time, people, like we've said in previous talks today, they weren't feeling fat, they were feeling low, they were feeling anxious, they were feeling this strong self-hatred. This strong self-hatred, which comes from body image, I guess, but stimulates such strong emotions. And then, of course, we talk about some of the typical behaviours that someone with disordered eating might experience, such as self-harm, binging and purging, restricted dieting and fasting, social withdrawal, avoiding wearing certain clothes, and other avoidance behaviours. And this is another tool that one of the young champions came up with, which I actually really like, because when we talk about feelings of fullness and feelings of hunger, a lot of the time we've used this like 0 to 10 scale, which actually isn't really very helpful, especially when you've got a bit of a preoccupation with numerical values. So we use more of a pendulum. And with this, I know on this one there is some numbers, but in the actual PowerPoint we decided that numbers actually weren't that helpful. But what this pendulum was supposed to demonstrate and illustrate is that how you have this neutral feeling, very much along the lines of intuitive eating, this exercise, but how you'd have this like neutral feeling and how you'd either have sensations of feeling really empty or really full, and just identifying how your behaviours would respond to that feeling. Again, taking something like this and putting it back in the formulation was really helpful for young people to sort of identify what was going on when they were checking in with ourselves. We also talked about other things like having a mood diary rather than a food diary, really unpacking what we're using food for, and someone brought to our attention the acronym HALT, which we've all heard before, but I've never really heard it in this context. And they were talking about, whether before you make a decision about food, whether that's to restrict or binge or purge, just really unpack, are you hungry, really? Are you angry, lonely, or tired? And those are some of the really basic emotions, like when we were looking at the inside-out diagram before, that can really help sort of just understand what's actually going on rather than looking to food as an emotional regulator first. Now, this is my favourite thing that they came up with. I thought it was really, really helpful, especially when we're going into schools and talking about things like this, which might not instantaneously resonate with people. When looking at disordered eating in more of a continuum, it's more likely that people will be able to identify on certain ends of the spectrum. So over here we've got, what's ideal? What do we really want? We want a healthy body image. We want people to eat intuitively and consciously. We want positive mental health. But with, society and all these social cultural factors and like Una was saying before, that big ball, we don't know what causes eating disorders, but there's a lot of factors out there. We might find ourselves somewhere along this continuum, this spectrum. And it's important to acknowledge as well that the young people really honed in on how socially acceptable some of these behaviours were. Things like the skinny teas and skinny coffees, which have got quite a lot of media interest recently. That was something that a lot of us had to be in our bonnet about. Funnily enough as well, one of the most sort of impactful pieces of information about these skinny teas that resonated with the young people a lot was their effect on the effectiveness of contraception. So if someone takes a contraceptive pill and the skinny teas sort of negate that and make it void, that was something that a lot of people didn't realise, but after learning that, got a huge reaction, which is really interesting, I think. But of course, moving along the spectrum, we have the more intense behaviours, and eventually we have the diagnostics: anorexia, binge eating, bulimia, EDNOS and OSFED. We also included the terms orthorexia and drunkorexia. Whilst I know these aren't recognised by the DSM, these are terms that were really important to the young people, and they really wanted included. Because when you're at that age, sort of 16 to 25, you're discovering drinking for the first time, people really wanted to highlight the relationship between drinking and their disordered eating. So we got a lot of questions around that, especially because we put it in inverted commas. It's not really a phrase many people like, and I understand why. But I really enjoy these key points that the young people came up with to remember about EDs. So the first thing, the most important thing that the young people felt was important to share with other young people was that anybody of any size, shape, gender, age, race, ethnicity, culture can be affected by an eating disorder or disordered eating. And this came out really strongly in our focus groups as well, because we had people with all sorts of diagnoses, from anorexia to bulimia to binge eating. And there was a real sentiment as well with the people who had binge purge sort of disorders, that this isn't talked about enough, and people need to talk about this, and they need to understand that just because of my body shape, it doesn't mean I've not got an eating disorder. And it was really good that this came out around the Eating Disorders Awareness Week, I think it was this year, where there was a real focus on the stereotypical sort of image of someone with an eating disorder. But yeah, that really resonated with young people. Also want to pick up on this, this idea of culture and ethnicity and religion, which actually came up quite a lot in our focus group as well. A lot of people were talking about some of the issues they'd faced coming from religious backgrounds and having eating disorders and trying to access help for them, and the sort of additional stigma within their community. They also talked a lot about religious fasting practices such as Ramadan, and how we as Rethink could possibly work with religious institutions to raise mental health awareness and sort of put things in place for people who might be struggling to adhere to these practices. I think the second point just hits the nail on the head, and it's very relevant for today, very on brand, about how disordered eating behaviours can be adopted as a means of emotional regulation, which is what we've been trying to say all day. And so that's where, you know, we referenced the formulation again that we did right at the very beginning, about how it's important to try to identify the thoughts, the feelings and the emotions which act as a driving force behind your behaviours. And then the final message that people wanted to share was that help and recovery is possible. You know, they wanted to reiterate that the human brain is so complicated, and so we shouldn't be embarrassed when we try to adopt these negative coping mechanisms. It's being open and honest, which are the first steps to accessing the right help. And again, that's when it was just so wonderful to see the young people share their stories with other young people and sort of see that light bulb moment for everyone who is a participant of the intervention. Now, boring numbers. So what we used for the step-up transitions evaluation was a generalised self-efficacy scale. We used that with the Tavistock Institute. And what we did for this pilot was just adapt the language. So instead of saying mental health, we'd say, no, instead of saying, I have a better understanding of the ways that can affect my mental health, would specifically say body image or disordered eating. But as you can see, the feedback's really good. You know, the minimum response was 75%, and just to explain how we work this out, it's the same way as the Tavistock. So they use a positive result as anyone who agreed or strongly agreed. So 98% of people agreed or strongly agreed that they enjoyed the sessions, 97.5% agreed or strongly agreed that they'll use the things learnt in this intervention to then find services that can help them if needed. But the best bit, the qualitative stuff. So what was the most useful part of the session? So people were saying things like all of it, everything, but the life experiences really came through. Life experiences, you know, understanding that others feel the same. This is the sort of thing that, you know, really gets my juices flowing, because it's just so important that we use lived experience to sort of break down some of these barriers to understanding eating disorders. Just to explain a couple of the pieces of feedback as well. When we were told how to deal with our insecurities by selling ourselves what they're good for. Don't quite know if that's proper English, but I think what they're referring to is this Post-it note game that we played. And what we did basically was get everyone to write down like their insecurities and things that they'd say to themselves maybe when they look in the mirror. So it's really trying to hone in on that critical voice that we know EDs often has. And then the twist was that we'd be like, okay, would you say that to a friend? And they'd be like, oh gosh, no, I'd never speak to anyone like that. And then to say, well, why are you speaking to yourself like that? We were building on the grounds of like self-compassion in a really like discreet and subtle way. So I quite enjoyed that. As well, like 16-year-olds talking about how beauty is a socially constructed idea. I'm like, oh my God, this is great. This is what we needed when we were at school. And importantly, I think one of the pieces of feedback was discussing gateways to eating disorders. And I think this is an important point to reiterate as well, because I think, like I said before, the hook to this intervention was body image and body confidence. Because going into a class of like 16-year-old boys and talking about eating disorders might get the back up a little bit. And I think that's why when we look at the questions around relevance and their own situation, they scored the lowest. They scored 70 and 75%. And so I think that was a really interesting piece of feedback, because I think it shows how we need to break down even more sort of the idea of the continuum and the idea of how things might start and then develop into a, you know, fully blown eating disorder. For anyone who loves public health, this is for you. So I personally love a public health model, and I love this one because when we look at this second tier, the secondary intervention, that means we're targeting young people aged 16 to 25 who are at risk of developing an eating disorder, right? But the twist, which I love, we're also capturing the experiences of young champions, the experts by experience who engaged in the project and maintained their recovery. And so that's why I want to share the qualitative results from the young champions themselves, because I think this is something so interesting that we could take forward in community services even. So, you know, just to highlight some of the things that young people said, you know, they really enjoyed discussing the best approaches to educate young people, opened up some interesting conversations. Conversations were daring, refreshing and groundbreaking. But then, this one, I found myself giving opinion after opinion, really using my personal experience in a valuable way. And for someone who's gone through an eating disorder, you know, that's probably not something that they're used to, like giving opinion after opinion. After we heard about the alexithymia things this morning, not often very great at expressing themselves. So to see that 180, I think was just magical. And just again, you know, really appreciating how they're able to utilize their own insights. Because body image and eating disorders are sometimes an overlooked topic which is rarely discussed in depth or at length. Well, not on my watch. Again, someone even makes reference to the body image voice, which I think is their interpretation of the eating disorder voice that there's a lot of literature on. And for an expert by experience who's engaged in intervention to start making these connections for their own recovery, like I said, I think this could mean something in terms of getting co-production projects out there in the community. So, just a few reflections from me. There's really something about how we've made CBT that is, you know, nice recommended, that you'd get in a one-to-one setting if you went down to the Maudsley, making that accessible for large groups of people. That's really exciting for me. And when I think about what the future could hold, you know, why can't we do this with other evidence-based therapies? Why couldn't we use cognitive analytical approaches or dialectical behavioural approaches? And if we could possibly adapt them to create like a universal prevention strategy or intervention, just how amazing would that be? But again, what really struck me was this reciprocity element and how this could mean recovery in community settings. I really think the possibilities haven't been explored enough, and I can't wait to do it myself. Which is what I'm going to do. So in terms of next steps, like I said, I'm starting my PhD in October, and I really want to use this pilot as a feasibility study. As you can tell, I get very excited about it. I really think we're onto something. And I think, especially to unpick some of the complexities around the sensitive issues I spoke to you about, you know, around religion, ethnicity and culture, there's no point me swooping in and saying, this is what I think you should do. It's got to come from the young people themselves. We're also currently scoping ways to make this step-up framework, the process rather than the product, sustainable post-big lottery funding. We are delivering until the end of this term, but obviously we want to just keep going. So if anyone's got millions of pounds, let me know. Yeah, and then just a few more links and resources about the work we've been doing at Rethink. So there's a full participatory evaluation of the Step Up Transitions project, which is available on the Tavistock's website. There's a really fabulous YouTube video that I'd encourage you to go and watch that's done by our young champions. A couple of other pieces of work we've done around prevention and early intervention, and as well we've been involved in the public health Ombudsman report, Ignoring the Alarms. So do have a look at that if you're at all interested. That's just me being a policy ad and boring. Thanks, that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I've also overrun, but no one said anything, so we'll just carry on until we get interrupted, I guess. If you have got any thoughts, comments, questions, pieces of feedback, either we could have a quick discussion now before we get interrupted, or just drop me a line, that's my email. So, thank you.